Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this discussion of structuralism. Today, we shall be talking about the narrative theory in structuralism. When we talk about narrative theory, we can have two types of narrations. One is from structuralism, and the other is from Russian formalism. Let's first look at structuralism and narrative theory. Narrative is an extraordinarily complex term in literary and critical theory. It is used interchangeably with story, form, plot, and even structure. Let's try and define narrative first before exploring the structuralist analysis of narrative. Paul Cobley provides a succinct definition when he states, narrative is a particular form of representation implementing the signs, S-I-G-N-S. Thus, a narrative is a system of signs which could be verbal, written, oral, gestural, iconic, in a particular sequence or order. But narrative is not restricted to stories or films. Narrative is also the construction of a nation, history, sports, and violence. Paul Wake defines narrative as the ways in which we construct notions of history, politics, race, religion, identity, and time. All of these things might be understood as stories that both explain and construct the ways in which the world is experienced. For purposes of literary and cultural analysis, we can define narrative as the act of representation using signs in particular sequences so that we can construct specific notions of reality, self, and the world. Our construction and interpretation of the world through the use of words, sounds, figures, gestures, and relations intrinsically linked to the language. In the 12th century, structuralism generated some of the most rigorous analysis of narrative and its forms. In what follows, we look at a few of the most important theories of narrative. The study of narrative is called as narratology, a term often used interchangeably with poetics. A term that is often used to describe the language of narrative and has come to occupy center stage in almost every theory today is discourse. So you have the narrative of the upper class, the narrative of the Dalits, the narrative of the blacks, and so on. Discourse traditionally meant spoken or written presentation. It is what we read or listen to. In the case of structuralism, this is the sense in which discourse is used. Now, after post-structuralism, it refers to the language used in social practice. That is, discourse now refers to the functional as well as social, political, ideological aspects of language, something we shall explore maybe in the post-structuralism part. The second variety of narratology is called as the Russian formalism and the poetics of fiction. As already understood, the Russian formalists were more interested in the language of poetry. In their later work, however, critics like Vladimir Prop, Viktor Shklovsky, and much later Zvetan Todorov explored narrative structure in fiction. More contemporary narratologists like Gerard Genette also built on the structuralism of the Russian formalism as they refined their study of prose narratives. The folk tale, Vladimir Prop's analysis of the folk tale, is a classic example of structuralist criticism at work. Prop argued that every character in a folk tale's plot had a specific function to perform. This in itself is hardly new. We know after structuralism that a plot is the consequence of many elements in relation with each other. What was fascinating about Prop's analysis is that he is able to locate a mere 7 key performers who create 7 spheres of action in any folktale. That is, all fairy tales can be reduced to a set of 7 characters. Can you believe it? 7 characters who generate the entire plot through their various relationships. Here is Prop's list. 1 is hero, the other is false hero, the 3rd is villain, the 4th is donor or provider, the 5th is helper, the 6th is princess and her father, the 7th is dispatcher. So these 7 will be there definitely in all the fairy tales. Now, Prop also identified 31 functions to be found in every folktale. These are so many, like absentation, interdiction, violation, reconscience, delivery, trickery, complicity, villainy, and lack, mediation, counteraction, departure, etc., etc., etc. Some 31 characters have been found by Prop. The folktale is thus reducible to this set of functions created by the 7 performers. So you have 7 performers and you have 31 functions. These 7 performers can be identified to perform one or the other function, thereby taking the folktale further. It is important to realize here that the number of spheres of action is finite, even when the number of characters is infinite. So what is very interesting is, it is the structuring principle of the entire story or the film. Here is a basic formula. The boy meets the girl, they fall in love, tension in families as a result. Boy or girl has to prove himself or herself, plot to ensure the lovers do not have a smooth path to marriage. Villain plays the dirty tricks, struggle of hero or heroine, villain is defeated, parents are reconciled, ultimately marriage and ending. Parents are not reconciled, villain wins, villain is defeated rather, but the hero and the heroine has to die. So a tragedy and the comedy revolve around one basic formula. And the job of a structuralist is to find out this formula according to the narratology, both Russian as well as structuralism. Now the structuralist narratology is very interesting for us to take further. The study of narrative was greatly facilitated by structuralism. It systematized the study of plot, character, symbol, and provided a formula for narratives, as seen in the work of Prop, as we just saw. One of the earliest practitioners of structuralist narratology is A.J. Gramius. A.J. Gramius, whose work in Semantic Structural that he published in 1966 is very interesting, which talks about the binary oppositions within the text. Saussure's idea of binary oppositions to develop what has been called a structural semiotics is what becomes the base for Gramius' Semantic Structural. Structural semiotics, Gramius paid close attention to the way in which the oppositions help us organize the meaning. He suggested that there are semantic units that work in opposition. He termed these as seams, S-E-M-E-S, seams, and argued that meaning emerges in the contrast between these seams. Some common seams would be this binary opposition is the primary structure, or maybe argued that these seams emerges in contrast. This binary opposition in the primary structure of all the meaning productions is technically called as signification. And Gramius was very much interested in finding out the seams in order to give you the meaning in the text. One also observes in a text the subject or object, sender or receiver, helper or opponent. Remember, as the earlier writer as Prop has already propagated into. These are the actants who perform the specific functions in almost all the narratives. With desire, search, aim, the subject has a certain aim and desire directed at a particular goal or the object to be achieved, number one. Number two is communication. The subject is sent out on his or her mission by a sender who facilitates the mission and will reward the subject upon her or his success. The receiver is the one who rewards. Number three, auxiliary support or hindrance. The subject is helped in his or her quest and mission by the helper and obstructed by the opponent. So helped by the helping friends and obstructed by the villains. In many cases, the categories might merge. For example, the sender actant might very well be the receiver also. And according to Gramius, a formula for the narrative can therefore be follows. Contract or prohibition, where the subject is sent out on a mission. You have some helpers to help him, you have some distractants to destroy him, and if he succeeds and he comes back, the reward is given. So that is the basic formula. That is the basic formula in any of the folk tales you observe. Either it is Cinderella's folk tale or Snow White's folk tale, and so on and so forth. The whole process can be read under three main structures or syntagms. One is contractual structures, where the hero is given a task by a sender and is sent out. The other is the performative structures, where the subject undertakes the tasks and performs something with courage and hope. The third is disjunctive structures. The disjunctive structures are moments of arrival, departure, and movement in the narrative when the subject leaves the palace or maybe the home. For example, in Hindi films, the hero swears vengeance and races out to the villain's house or den in order to kill him and punish him, and comes back. From a scene involving a hero actant, we know how one of the villain actant too. Yes or no? So you have a definite structure like contractual structures, performative structures, and disjunctive structures, and the job of a structuralist is to find out all these structures and thereby build up the entire story. The next we have is Zvitan Todorov. Like Grimus, Zvitan Todorov builds on the notion that there is a definite grammar to all the texts. Todorov isolates three specific components of texts semantics. One which would be the form syntactic, the other which would be the arrangement of structural units which are verbal, and the third is words and phrases through which the entire story is told. Todorov's interest lies mainly in the syntactic arrangement of units within a narrative. He identifies two key structural components of all texts: propositions and sequence. Propositions are the basic actions in a narrative. In a novel like R.K. Narayan's The Guide, which all of us know, the basic proposition may be listed as following. Raju meets Rosie. Rosie and Raju fall in love. Raju encourages her in her art. Rosie becomes popular. Raju betrays her trust. Raju goes away. Raju is a transformed person into a saint by accident. He decides to accept his sainthood and fulfills his vow. Now, these are all called as the propositions and the sequence. These propositions have to be arranged in a sequence in order to generate a story. There can be many sequences in a text. Propositions can be arranged in any of the three sequences. Number one, temporal, where there is a sequence in time. First what happens, then what happens, and then what happens. Number two is logical, where there is a cause and effect. This happened and therefore that happened is the logic. And number three is spatial, where the plot has many subdivisions and this time happened meanwhile the other things also happened, sometimes going into the flashback, sometimes going into the forward, and so on and so forth. So how will the narrative, how will the writer take the story further is what is called as a sequence. Whether it is a logical straight sequence, or whether it is a temporal sequence, or whether it is a spatial sequence. So first you should have propositions, as Todorov says, and the way in which you present will become the sequence. So if this is understood, according to Zvitan Todorov, you can have a structuralist reading of the text. The next interesting person in this narratology of structuralism is Mikhail Bakhtin and his philosophy or principle of dialogism. He is a Russian thinker, Mikhail Bakhtin, whose works appear in English decades after he wrote them in the 1920s and 30s. Proposed the dialogue as the intrinsic feature of language. While Bakhtin himself never used the term dialogism, it has been associated with his work and is the most recognizable concept from his work. In order to understand his work on the novel or narrative, it's important to look at his notions of what dialogue is. There are a few terms in Bakhtinian thought that have to be understood, namely dialogue, heteroglossia, chronotype, and carnival. These are the four important words that Bakhtin proposes. Dialogue, the very first word, is a differential relation, and dialogue always implies a relationship. In any conversation, the speakers are different from each other. But what is interesting is that these differences are retained in the conversation. They are held in place in the relation with which is the dialogue. Dialogue is imposed upon us. We do not set out to engage in dialogue. Dialogue, therefore, is a concept that gestures at the mutual difference at the heart of all conversation. It asks us to pay attention to relations in language. It is, as Bakhtin believed, the existence of mutual difference that enabled a dialogue. If both of us are not agreeing to one thing, then I'll talk putting up my point and you will talk putting up your point, and thereby it becomes a dialogue. If all of us are listening to Lord Buddha, there is no dialogue at all and agreeing with it. The dialogue occurs only if we are disagreeing with it. Again, the opposites, as Sassour himself has said or Prop had said. Right? It is Bakhtin who has emphasized focusing on the self or other aspect of all language, where there is always the other within my speech. So in the same speech as I talk, there is always the other, and it is the other that we have to find out in the dialogue. In fact, my speech anticipates and prepares for others' response. Bakhtin's emphasis on dialogue means that his focus was almost entirely on the language and utterance. Utterance take place between two speakers who are located in a social context. Speakers have to assume that their values are shared by others. Audience? And in this case, when I'm speaking, I know that you are listening to it and you are able to follow it. And whatever questions you have, maybe you could ask me. Only then the dialogue completes. You can ask me either through the questions, or maybe through the phone calls, or maybe through the classroom discussions, or maybe through the WhatsApp messages. Dialogue is the central feature of all speech. What Bakhtin does is to underscore the novel as a form that explicitly foregrounds this dialogic aspect of speech and everyday communication. Bakhtin begins by assuming that literary texts, especially novels, are utterances in a given context of the text's production. Dialogism has already told us that meanings in any utterance is based on the social context. So, no dialogue can be in air. It always requires a context. Indeed, the context is what makes us understand the words themselves. For example, when I hear a sentence like, the ball is in the box. Now you have listened to it, the ball is in the box. I immediately understand that it refers to the particular box and not to any other box, because I have used the box. Alright, and I am also specific of which ball. It is the ball or not any ball. So some context is there regarding the ball and the box, which you know and I know, and only then I can utter this dialogue of the ball is in the box. Yes or no? So dialogism always will have a social context. Heteroglossia, which is the second interesting phenomena that is raised by Bakhtin, is that novels are a prime example of what he calls heteroglossia. Hetero is many, glossia is meaning. From the same text, you get different meanings. The same text read at different parts of your life will give you different meanings. When you read the same text or watch the same film some 10th time, your meaning is different. Some 20th time, the meaning is different. And the first time, the meaning is altogether different. Did you observe this? So the different meanings coming from the same text or the film is called as heteroglossia. Heteroglossia is the simultaneity of many levels of dialogue and language. The subject about to make an utterance can pick one response out of the mass of languages around him or her. It would be impossible to systematize the mass and variety of languages because of the sheer heterogeneity. The other's voice is given as much importance as the self's. In the case of the novel, Bakhtin normally examples Dostoevsky's novels. The many voices are given equal importance, and thereby showing the novel as a site of struggle, carnival, and subversion. Working class discourses, women's language, the language of the ethnic minorities are all represented alongside that of the dominant one. Even if these voices do not overthrow the dominant one, their very existence suggests that the main voice is not overwhelming or unchallenged. In the case of a novel, every novel refers to other works or other discourses. The novel is a genre that gives space very consciously to the other works also. This is what Bakhtin calls it as intertextuality. So no text is isolated. Every text is connected to the other texts, either existing in the contemporary times or maybe the past. And is a feature, intertextuality is a feature Bakhtin was particularly fond of in the novel. The job of a critic is to find out, number one, dialogue, number two, heteroglossia, and number three, the intertextuality also. Only then the real meaning of the text can be decoded. A novel refers to the discourse of history, of literary text, of social conditions like poverty, philosophy, theology, and this leads Bakhtin to suggest that the novel embodies other voices also, other subjects also. In fact, it gives space to the other, the different. For example, in a realistic novel like Charles Dickens or Balzac, Charles Dickens you must have read, the narrator controls the lives of his characters very firmly. Yet, even these authors sometimes slip into the phrases like I think or I suppose. Now, what does this mean? It means simply that the novelist is unsure of the moral stance he or she has taken. The characters and their situations are not as rigidly controlled as one perceives. The main moral stance in the novel is therefore undermined by the other voices and the opinions that circulate through the text. This is what is called as heteroglossia. Later, critics like Julia Kristeva built upon this notion of intertextuality. The novel is constituted by the dialogue between discourses. What is clear and important is that the novel's dialogism even breaks down the distinction between literary and non-literary or extra-literary texts, which is very interesting. Most of the research today is to find out the intertextual relevance of the dialogues that are present within the texts. The third concept that Bakhtin talks about is chronotype. The chronotope further proposed that a novel often renders in an artistic way the interconnectedness of spatial and temporal relationships. Space and time are interconnected in plots and are central to the narrative plot. This interconnected aspect is what he terms as chronotope. Chronotopes are recurring structural features of narrative. Therefore, they are like the motifs or the actuants in structuralism. Using the example of Greek romances, Bakhtin shows how time and space are both fluid. Every age has its own notions of space and time, and therefore chronotopes are rooted in their local conditions. In the 20th century, after Einsteinian science and the development in physics, we have a different sense of space and time. Chronotopes in science fiction today therefore suggest multiple worlds and the existence of multiple worlds whose time zones are also multiple. So we have much literature regarding chronotope of Bakhtin that the same person lives in different time zones in different parts of space, and thereby the young young hero is seen in one zone, the middle-aged hero is seen in the other zone, whereas in the other zone you could see the old-aged hero. Much literature has been written with this time-space, mixture. Many films also have come into existence expressing the chronotopes. The simultaneity of words would mean that simultaneously different worlds exist, and the world exactly as we see today, so many other worlds are there, where one Padmara of the young generation or maybe at the age of 10 is there in one area, 20 is there in the other area, 30 is there in the other time zone, and 50 is there in the other time zone. Maybe in the other time zone, if I go, I'll be seeing a Padmara who has become old also. It's very fascinating, it's very interesting. The simultaneity of worlds and times is also connected with the globalized geopolitical world, where radio, telephone, television, and now the internet and all call centers functioning in different time zones. That's one of the reasons why the call centers are open in the night. Throughout the night they are open because USA and Europe are working. Though it is night for us, they'll be working because so the time and space zones have mixed up, and that is what has given rise to a new realism, which Rushdie's novels normally express, which is called as the magic realism in the post-colonial texts of South Africa, Asia, South America and all. Today generates chronotopes that are about multiple times, multiple spaces coexisting next to each other. It's so surprising that now it is night time, 6 o'clock for us today, and maybe in some other part of the world, maybe in America, it is morning. It is morning for us now, and maybe in Europe or in UK, it is past midnight. So it is very surprising that different time zones exist on the earth itself. Then imagine different time zones and space zones across the cosmos. It's very fascinating. And sci-fi, scientific fiction, is written based upon this notion of chronotope. Bakhtin, as we can see, is keen on showing how the novel as a form is inherently heteroglossic, different meanings are obtained, giving space to many voices. The novel resists monologic and situates language as well as discourses alongside with each other. The next interesting phenomena that Bakhtin talks about is carnival. Carnival, Bakhtin evidently was attempting to find literary examples where power was subverted, where the rich was dominating the poor, and suddenly you could find that the poor dominates the rich. Subversion is ulta hona. So through the French Revolution, you could see the feudal lords were haunted and were killed by the workers. The men being dominated by the women, the Dalits getting an upper hand. So all this, the black getting the upper hand in American literature, all these carnivalic expressions. So the carnival was laughter, the bodily, parody, the ugly, the grotesque, and the so-called low. The laughter is not sanctioned by the government or the institution. It resists such control and is therefore politically subversive. Bodily functions are a part of the carnival because they do not find expression in official cultures anywhere. Clowning, again not part of the official culture, is also a key element of the carnival. Clowning and the carnival cannot be theorized about because they resist any academic discourses. Now, all this type of subversions, carnivalic subversions, are seen in the modern writers like Salman Rushdie and his very famous book titled as Midnight's Children. For example, in Midnight's Children, Rushdie Salim, who is the hero, believes that the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965 happened because he imagined it. Time space. Here, Rushdie is reducing a massive event to a single individual's fantasy. There is nothing remarkable in the situation of war. It all exists in the person's mind. And this is carnivalesque because it subverts a so-called national event and transforms it to a mundane activity of daydreaming and adolescent fantasy. So such like things you can find in a number of texts, right? Similarly, you could find in Margaret Atwood's characters also, or any of the modern texts, trying to find out what exactly is the dialogue that existed, what is heteroglossia that you find in the novel, the chronotype and the subversion of carnival that you find, gives a very wonderful structuralist study of the modern type. Bakhtin's contribution through dialogism is tremendous in the structuralistic mode. After Bakhtin, equally interesting personality is Rola Barthes. Rola Barthes and his codes are very important in the study of structuralism. Barthes is an interesting figure in literary theory because he is located at the intersection of structuralism and post-structuralism. His early work is inspired by structuralistic ideas and later works on the death of the author, gesture at the post-structuralistic sympathies. Barthes, in his structuralist analysis of narrative in 1977 and S by Z that he published in 1970, it's very, very famous S by Z article, developed a detailed model of narrative. Like the structuralists, Barthes believed that one can break up a narrative into its constituent elements and discover how they combine with each other. Reading a short story by Balzac, Barthes identified 561 units of meaning, or what he calls it as lexias. Barthes proposed, here the parallels with Prop and Gramers must be evident to us, that we could organize the lexias into 5 main groups, all working in combination in a narrative. That is, the 5 groups or codes, as he calls them, are very important, and the narrative's modes of organizing the units is also meaning is generated. One is proeretic code. The first code is. This is the most visible aspect of a narrative and refers to the sequence in which the events of the story are unfolded. It is often a temporal sequence, and this happens and then this happens and then it is followed by some other event, and so the way in which linearly in time something happens. This code governs our expectations of a narrative. If this happened, the next thing must come down to existence. So the first one is what is called as a proeretic code, which follows a logical sequence. The second one is called as the hermeneutic code. This is the code that informs our interpretation and asks questions we ask of the narrative. What happened? How? Why? By whom? Etc. So hermeneutic codes will have the readers or the audience's questions. The third code is called as the cultural code. This is the code that narratives assume we shall share. Cultural codes are those elements of common knowledge that we share as a community and therefore do not require a glossary. This can be medical, literary, or even symbolic knowledge. An example would be a narrative that uses a sentence like, during the Raj, things were very different. What Raj? The British Raj. So during the Raj, we go back into the British times. Right? Most Indians would immediately understand the term Raj would mean British Raj. And you don't require any glossary. It is the cultural code because we all share the common culture. All of us know what British rule is, what British Raj is, what freedom struggle is, and how we became free, and so on and so forth. Because we all share a common culture. So this is what we mean by cultural code. The fourth that Barthes talks about is the semic code. This is the code that draws upon, like in the cultural code, a common set of stereotypes that are self-descriptive and self-evident. When, for example, we see a man in white clothes and wearing a Gandhi cap, we immediately know that he is a politician. Yes or no? The stereotype is well in place for all the readers and therefore does not require any explanation at all. If somebody is wearing the orange dress and is wearing a turban, as you find in the Astrologer's Day by R.K. Narayan, immediately you would find him placed as a seer or a saint in the Hindu culture, and maybe an astrologer, as we could make him out. So this is a common cultural code and a semic code. The fifth that you have is what is called as the symbolic code. This is very similar to that of the semic code. It extends beyond the immediate icon or stereotype to refer to something larger. For example, a horror film thrives in the images of darkness. A shot of the moon, treetops, silent streets, closed door, hooting of the owls, barking of the dogs, all these will represent symbolically the darkness, the night, and also the horror feeling. A shot of the moon, treetops, all these help us to understand the picture in a better way, in a symbolic way. But because we were aware of the significance of the night in horror films, and here we are drawing upon a previous experience of such films, we expect something dangerous or evil to happen immediately. Yes or no? This shifts the code from the semic, where we understand it as night, from the signs of moon and empty streets, to the symbolic level, where we know something dangerous is going to happen. So this Bhatt sees every narrative as being composed of lexias that are organized in the form of 5 main codes. The proeretic, about the sequence of the narrative; the hermeneutic, which is interpretative by asking questions; cultural, which is the common knowledge; semic, which is the stereotypes; and symbolic, which is semantic and symbolic expression of the semic codes. It is with this that we get the meaning as said by Roland Barthes. Barthes is followed by Gerard Genette. Narrative discourses and the paratexts of Genette's works on narrative discourse has spread across many areas. His contributions include studies of narrative voices, levels of narration, and is more interestingly on what he calls as the paratexts. That is what is the term that is coined by Genette. Genette identifies 3 levels of narrative. One is history or story, the other is recit or narrative, and the third is what is called as the narration. Let's briefly look into these 3. History or story is a set of real actions or the events that happened and need to be told in the text. Recit or narrative, which is the telling of the story either in the oral or the writing form. And the third is what is called as narrating, which is a larger process of recounting that produced the recit. Another way of putting this would be history is the content, the story, the signified of all the storytelling. Recit is the speech or the written act, the signifier or form through which the entire story is told. And narrating is the telling within the speech or writing. So simple. History is the story, recit is the narrative, signifier and signified, and narrating is the way in which you tell it. So it is this that the structuralist has to concentrate on while getting the meaning of it. If we want a scheme that shows a breakup of Genette's organization, we get the story, text, narration with the narrative voice, with the narrative instance, narrative theme, narrative levels. There are different levels that he talks about. All this is what is called as the metalepsis. Here the narrative moves between the 2 stories of 2 different things, whereupon we go into the metalepsis. To understand this, let us take an example of Frankenstein. All of us are aware of the horror novel of Frankenstein written by Mary Shelley. That's the only novel that is written by her. The story is Walton's discovery of Frankenstein. Walton is the hero and Frankenstein is the devil. So Walton discovers Frankenstein, he gets scared, and then what happens next is the entire story. But the plot is the story of the scientist and the monster. Scientist is Walton, monster is Frankenstein. Walton's order of events is not necessarily the order in which the plot of Frankenstein monster moves. This is called as anachrony. But Frankenstein also exhibits another level. It breaks up Frankenstein's story to give us something from Walton. Here the narrative moves between the two stories or narrative levels, and this is what is called as the metalepsis, which is very interesting contribution of Janet. Janet proposed the term transtextuality, which is a more wide-ranging one, and isolated 5 main types of intertextuality. Number one is what is called as the paratexts, which are the epigraphs, prefaces, forewords, epilogues, addresses to the readers, acknowledgements, footnotes, drafts, illustrations that are somehow connected to the main narrative. So that is the first one. Paratexts is the one. The second is called as the intertextuality. It refers to the allusions, references to other works, echoes, codes, citation, and even plagiarized sections of the work is intertextuality. The next is architextuality. Architextuality is the relationship of text or other texts in the same genre. For example, the connection between the 20th century satirical poem by W.H. Auden has an architextual connection with the satires of Alexander Pope. That happens many a times. The next intertextuality is called metatextuality. Metatextuality is the relationship between a text and the critical commentaries, biographical commentaries, and other references of the main text. And the next one is hypertextuality, which resembles metatextuality in that it refers to texts that come later or after the main or the original text. The original text is hypotext and the later one is called as the hypertext. So you have hypertextuality and hypotextuality. The examples of this would be Frankenstein. According to Spike Milligan, a hypertext, a spoof of Mary Shelley's hypotext, Frankenstein. Edward Bond's Lear is an adaptation of and a hypertext to Shakespeare's play. Janet's work, as can be imagined by his range and typologies, is enormously useful in identifying features of the narrative. And Janet's contribution in terms of metalepsis and intertextuality is tremendous. Julia Kristeva is the next interesting contributor in the narratology of structuralism. Julia Kristeva popularized the notion of literary texts, which are called as the intertextuality. Kristeva's structuralism emphasized the connection between two texts. Even as she saw texts not as closed systems, but as dynamic processes open to the world. Discourse itself is a practice that involves the linguistic element, but also the unconscious and the social relations in which the linguistic act is enunciated. Now, Kristeva, being a psychoanalyst, definitely has combined the unconscious mind to the text. Literary analysis must not be restricted to the text itself, Kristeva argues, because the text itself must be seen as located within the social relations, ideology, and the unconsciousness. According to Kristeva, such an analysis means searching for the signifying phenomena of the crisis or the unsettling process of meaning and subject, rather than for the coherence or identity of either one or multiplicity of structures. What Kristeva is proposing is intertextuality, that is, bringing to the fore the connections between the texts and not to close off the text. And this intertextuality can be associated with social relations, ideology, and definitely to the unconsciousness. With this, we come to the end of the discussion of the entire part of narratology, right? When you talk something like author and reader, it's very surprising that so far we have looked at the language of a narrative with little attention to the author or the reader. In the next part, we shall talk about the author and reader. Thank you very much for being a part of this explanation. Bye for now. Let's meet in the next video.